Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. One of the big challenges in chess is how to prioritize between different important things. Well, if the choice is to defend your king, to avoid getting checkmated, or lose material, the choice is obvious. You of course want to make sure you don't get checkmated because that would be the end of the game. Or, for example, strategical advantages or values are less important than material. For example, if your choice is that you need to double up two of your pawns or lose a pawn, typically would rather double them up and still keep them rather than lose it altogether. Yet at some other cases, things are not that obvious. And in general, the big challenge in chess is what to target, what's my plan? And those are some of the questions we look for answers in this lesson. Let's see our first example. Here we go. In this rook and pawn endgame, where each side has a rook and 5 pawns, it is White's turn. White has an obvious move in this position, and typically one of the first things to look at in any position is there any piece that I can capture for free? And if you ask yourself that question, hopefully you'll come to the answer, yes, White can capture indeed a pawn for free, moving the rook to d7. Well, if you notice that, that's certainly a great thing. However, in this case, White can do even better. And as the famous saying goes, when you see a good move, look for a better one. Well, in this case, the most important thing is that White has a far advanced passed pawn on a5. Now, as long as the rooks are on the board, this is not such a key element. However, if you would imagine the black rook and the white rook disappearing, like if they weren't on the board, then you'd notice that the white pawn would simply run, and in just 3 more moves get promoted. While at the same time, the black pawn is 4 squares away from the promotion square, and on top of it, the white king could easily come closer and stop that pawn from promoting. In the meantime, the black king is very far from the a-file. There is no way it could catch White's 8th pawn. So going back to our position, we'll realize that the number one goal is obviously to checkmate. But we cannot checkmate anytime real soon. We'll need to accumulate more advantages, perhaps promote our a-pawn, in order to eventually checkmate. So the checkmate in this case is the long-term plan. Our short-term plan should be to try to get rid of the pair of rooks that are on the board. And hopefully, with the hint given, you realize what the correct move here is, and it is to give a check to the black king and at the same time give black no choice but to exchange those rooks. It doesn't matter whether black moves his king out of the check or blocks the check by pushing their g-pawn up, or trades the rook themselves on d6. In any scenario, the 2 rooks would be exchanged. For example, g6, rook captures, pawn captures, and the a-pawn is running away with nobody to stop it. Or, if we go back to the starting position, rook d6, black trades himself, pawn takes back, again, the a-pawn is unstoppable. So this is a typical scenario when you need to try to figure out what are the most important things in the position. And again, typically, if you can checkmate, it is to checkmate. And then second of all, if you can win material or promote a pawn to a queen, which is in a way a type of winning material, because you transform a 1-point piece to a 9-point piece. So it's kind of the ultimate gain of material. Obviously, if in this position, if it would be black's turn, black would need to do everything they can to prevent the rooks from being exchanged. They could do that, for example, by moving the rook back to c7, which at the same time would also protect the pawn on d7. Or another option could be instead to move the king back to h7, although that would still allow white to grab the pawn on d7. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, white has significant material advantage, having an extra knight and pawn. Well, what is black's only hope? Well, since they have only one additional piece other than the king, it must be the little pawn on b3. And that's something special about pawns, that when they are far advanced, they become very powerful. And if they become promoted to a queen, obviously black would have a winning material advantage, despite having only a queen in addition to the king. Now, in this position, it is white's turn, and if white would try to run with the king and catch black's b-pawn, they would arrive too late. For example, king e1, b2, king d2, just one move too short. If the king would reach the c2 square, then as soon as black would promote, the white king would capture a new queen. However, it is black's turn at this moment, and black will indeed promote the pawn to a queen, and now black has a clear material advantage. So the question is, what should white do? There are few things to recognize in this situation. One is that the white pawns are much further behind, much further away from their promotion square than its black's counterpart. What that means is that if white would try to run and push the pawn, black would arrive a lot sooner. In fact, this is with a check, and then could easily go behind white's a-pawn and capture it. So that certainly would not be a good thing from white's perspective. Well, that leaves us with only one option, and sometimes there are situations like here when going with the method of elimination, the elimination of your choices, can lead to finding the correct solution. Because typically, when the opponent has a passed pawn, the first thing you want to look at, can my king simply walk next to it and catch it just on time, so when the enemy pawn gets promoted, our king would just capture it right then and there. If that's not in the picture, then you would look at your other pieces, see if one of them can quickly get there and stop it from promoting. In our case, white has a way to stop the pawn from promoting, but only if they find the correct sequence of moves with the knight. The easiest way to figure out how a knight or even another piece could catch a passed pawn that's eager to get promoted is to figure out a square that controls the promotion square. So in our case, when we are talking about a knight, those squares would be a3, which controls the b1 square. It could be c3, but we do have a pawn there. So therefore, that would be a waste of time in order to move the pawn to clear the c3 square for the knight, or the d2 squares. So these are the three squares from where the white knight would be ready to capture black's newly born queen. Now, here is the next step. Which one should white try to get to? Well, a3, I have to say, looks rather unlikely since that's the furthest one from the white knight's current position. So that leaves us with c3 or d2. As I mentioned a minute ago, c3 again may not be very realistic as we do have our own pawn there, and in order to move to the c3 square with the white knight, first the pawn would need to move forward to clear that space. Well, again, with the method of elimination with logic, we realized that the most logical possibility would be to get our knight to d2. However, the black pawn is not quite yet ready to get promoted, so that means we get two moves to get there, which is good news, certainly because we cannot get there in one move, even if we'd like to. So the next step is to figure out where can the knight go to d2 from. And there are a whole bunch of squares theoretically. There is c4, there is b1, there is e4, there could be f1. So there are quite a few squares where the knight could get to f3, right? All those squares that are highlighted, that are light squares, are squares from where the white knight could go to d2 from. So now we need to figure out which of those squares can the knight move to right away. And the only one that works, even though f1 would work if the king wouldn't be in our way, but it is, so therefore the only correct move is to move to e4. And now, when black advances the pawn, almost getting ready to promote it to a queen, the knight arrives to d2 just on time. So in this position, the important task was to recognize what's important about the position. And what is important in this position from white's perspective is to make sure white does not allow the black b pawn to get promoted without it being right away captured as soon as it promotes. After white stabilizes that task as of getting ready to stop the pawn, the next step will be to move our king towards the black pawn and try to capture it. Obviously, white is in a winning position. Let's move on to our next example, which is a pawn endgame. Again, what we should try to figure out in this position, what is black's weakness or what should be our target? In pawn endgames, there are two main ideas, and kind of one is connected to another. If we already have a passed pawn, we should always keep in mind, always investigate whether is that pawn ready to go and get promoted. If we recognize that the pawn will not reach its goal, the other end of the board, because along the way it may get captured or it can be blocked or for some other reason it's not a time yet to push the pawn, we need to look for some other choice. Or of course, if we don't even have yet a passed pawn, like the case is here, then we need to look for something else. Now typically in pawn endgames, the ultimate goal is to create a passed pawn which eventually can be promoted. That's the whole purpose of pawn endgames. Oftentimes, we are even willing to sacrifice, to give up 1, 2, or sometimes more pawns just in order to create one single passed pawn that's free to run and will be unstoppable. Now, in this scenario that we see in front of us, the situation is rather simple because all we need to do is find the weak point in Black's camp, and that is the pawn that's furthest from his own king. Because in this position, the Black king is the only piece that could potentially protect that pawn. However, if White plays accurately, the Black king will not arrive timely to protect that weakness. White simply should run the fastest possible way to attack Black's b5 pawn, and then to c5, and now Black is helpless against White capturing the b5 pawn next. Once that will happen, for example, king d7, king b5, we'll have a free passed pawn that's ready to run along the a file. Now you may say, but the Black king is right here, stopping the pawn's eventual promotion, which is very true. But here, all of a sudden, we transpose to a different, very important scenario, namely that White has a so-called outside passed pawn. All of a sudden, after White accomplished winning the pawn, has to change direction and go to the other side of the board with the king by, for example, playing king c5, while now the Black king is busy guarding the a pawn. The White king is free to roam around and simply go after the Black pawns on the king side and then promote one or both of the White pawns. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this double rook endgame, each side has 5 pawns. Generally speaking, rook endgames with equal material tend to be very often a draw. However, as we shall see, activity in endgames can be extremely important. As you may have heard already, rooks belong on open files. And you can see right now how beautifully White has both of their rooks on the open C and D files. Now, occupying an open file in itself shouldn't necessarily mean much. However, the whole purpose of occupying the file is, on one hand, to take away space from the opponent, to gain control of squares instead of our opponent, but even more importantly is to break in to the enemy camp. And there is a famous concept occupying the 7th rank, which we shall see in this example. White should enter to the 7th rank, which is key for various reasons. On one hand, Black typically would have several pawns still back there that can become target of attack. And second of all, most often, the enemy king tends to be on the 8th rank. And because of that, this can create some checkmate patterns that White can play for. Right now, White with its last move has attacked Black's pawn on b7. Let's see what will happen if Black simply advances that pawn forward away from the attack's way. Remember this idea, it's extremely powerful when both rooks of the same color reach to the opponent's 7th rank. This is extremely powerful not just because the rook now attacks the a7 pawn, but perhaps even more importantly, because it creates a checkmate threat. For example, if black now advances the a pawn to a5 away from the attack, white with a few well-placed checks will announce checkmate. The first one obviously is rook g7, check. Now if the king goes to f8, then an immediate checkmate arrives. Or if the king goes the other way, there is still a checkmate, but it takes just a bit longer. Check, and the other rook needs to come to g7. And now when the king moves to f8, all of a sudden, checkmate with the rook in the corner. Beautiful. So remember, open files, if you can put your rook on a file that has no other pawns, that's considered an open file. Even if there would be other pieces such as a bishop or a knight or a queen, it would still be considered an open file. As long as there is no pawn on the file, it's open file. And the other main purpose of occupying the open file is to try to enter to the opponent's 7th rank. And as we saw, that can be extremely dangerous and powerful. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, what we should try to do is recognize what should be our target. Our target is typically something that we may want to attack for one reason or another. In this case, the easiest target is the pawn on a7. Why? Because it's on the same color as our own bishop runs on. Obviously, the white bishop cannot even possibly attack the pawns that are on light squares. Now you may wonder, why shouldn't we attack the c7 pawn then? By playing, for example, bishop a5. While that certainly is not a bad move, but at the moment, the black knight at least protects that pawn. So therefore, our target is to attack the pawn on a7, and the natural square to do it from is c5. Therefore, white's correct move is bishop to b4, with the idea to then show up on c5 and then capture the pawn. If right now black would try to play knight d6 with the idea to protect the pawn with knight c8, that would fail because black now couldn't avoid the exchange between the white bishop and the black knight, followed by a pawn sacrifice, and then unavoidably the white pawn gets promoted. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, we have equal material. And here it's important to notice that the black king is in a very delicate situation because the white rook cut its way away from the rest of the board on the g file. Only if the white rook, the other white rook, would be able to get to h3. That would be checkmate. Well, white can achieve that not in a very difficult manner. Rook d3, and then voila. Always try to use your imagination, and of course try to be somewhat realistic that you can achieve it, at least within a couple of moves. And then you can get there. So checkmate threat is coming on h3. Black can only try to prevent that by moving the rook to the 6th rank, so after white would check, the black rook would block the check. However, now white would have a very powerful move, disconnecting the black rook from the other side of the board, and now black cannot avoid checkmate or major loss of material. What should we do in a situation like this? What's our target? The first thing we should recognize is that the difference between the two kings is tremendous. While white has a very safe and sound defense in front of his own king, black certainly cannot pride with the same. And that is an open invitation for an attack. And our most dangerous attacking piece is our queen. So we definitely want it to get to the attack as soon as possible, and with a check preferably. The black king moves, and now whether we give a couple more checks to get our queen even closer to the black king, or even play rook e3 right away, will create a similar type of checkmate threat as we did in our last example. And finally, let's look at this example, where black at the moment has the material advantage. However, white has created a dangerous pin. What that means is that if the black knight would to move right now, black would lose his queen. However, if it would be black's turn, black would get a time to move his queen away from the pin and still protecting the knight. That's why time is the essence, and it's very important for white to immediately use the pin. The way to do that is to play knight d5, attack the knight a second time, and black cannot avoid losing material. Thank you for listening, and be back next week. Bye-bye.